My name is Julio Ottino. I'm the Dean of the School of Engineering, McCormick, and I want to welcome all of you. What is essentially an experiment. We ask ourselves what would be a question that will have longevity, that couldn't be exhausted in one meeting or two or three, that will serve to link diverse parts of a university. University is full of interesting people, and we wanted to bring people from Northwestern and Chicago and pose a question that will enrich the audience and enrich all of us. And the question that we posed ourselves was the nature of creativity. And the goal is to expose people to different viewpoints. We have two people who are at the top of the game. You have the bios in what you have in front of you. One is Bill Baker, who is a partner in Skidmore. Bill was responsible for the construction of the Burj Khalifa, which is the tallest building in the world. He also was responsible for the first zero energy building in China, and is someone that you tell them, I'm going to be in Seoul next week, and you have buildings in there. He says, yeah, I can point several in there. So that's the environment that Bill lives in. Saul Morson is probably the most distinguished humanist we have in Northwestern. His work is not something that he can go and point out, but it's something that lives for a long while. Is essays, books, critiques, and is one of the people in Northwestern that is able to teach classes for 500 students in Russian literature and have a packed house. Now, we wanted to have people here who had produced a body of work. And by that, I mean Mozart, when he was young, produced really great work, but he wouldn't be good for this because he probably wouldn't articulate how is that he did what he did. Okay? We wanted people who could distance themselves and explain what is that they did.
You don't want to wait for Mozart till he's old, though.
So, yeah, a young Mozart wouldn't be good, and probably an old Beethoven would be better. So what I want to just say very briefly is the following. Bill is in a world where the end product is a building or something that has to do with urban planning. And Saul is in a world where words arranged together, critiques, essays, are the final product, okay? In every activity of where humans participate, resulting in some products, like buildings or words arranged carefully, there are two things that I want to mention, and this is the only time in which I will state two terms that will serve as kind of the groundwork for this. There is the domain, and there is the field, okay? The domain is everything that has been produced by people working in a given activity that outlives humans, okay? If humans were to disappear, the buildings could still be there. The buildings that had been once there and they were destroyed, there will be records of those. The buildings that had not been planned would still be records of that. In physics would be every paper ever written, every patent, everything. In books, poems, they will exist, okay? But when you look at that body of work and you distance yourself, there are things that shine brightly and things that they don't shine much at all. There are good things and background, okay? Who decides what are the good things that get in there? And what decides what is part of this domain, and if you start thinking about it, in every course that you take, you study the still version of that domain, the things that people have determined they are things worth passing from one to the other one. What determines that is the field, and the field are the people who practice in the domain. So in the case of mathematics, there are all the mathematicians who review proofs, pretty clean cut, what makes it and what doesn't, okay? In physics will be papers that get reviewed, they get published in different journals. Some journals are more prestigious than others. That determines some kind of pecking order. In architecture, structural engineering is more complex. Yes, there are prizes to the best design, the best architect. Some people like Bill get elected to the National Academy. There are architectural critics. The New York Times has one, the New Yorker has another one. But it's a consensus that emerges as a bottom-up decision. In literature, yeah, there are prizes, there are critics, there are a whole bunch of things, but eventually, in order for something to be part of this domain and be new, at some moment, the idea had to contain elements of creative thought, okay? And that's what we'll be discussing in here. So with that being said, as a kind of probably too lengthy of an introduction, could you say 2 words about the products that emerge from your work? In your case, buildings, structures, and let's start with you, Bill, and then Saul.
Okay, I'm a partner in an architectural engineering firm, okay? So what I do is I work with architects, other structural engineers, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, specialty consultants. And what we try to do is we try to create buildings or in case urban plans that are appropriate for the need. We never do the same thing twice. We always build the prototype. Okay, we've never done the same building twice. Because that's the nature of the practice we're in. Every client we have wants a building they've never seen before. Not everyone, but a lot of them do. Okay, and so that's the world I live in. Okay.
Saul?
Well, I start with the great Russian novels of ideas, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and I view them as examining the great ideas by not just seeing where they're logically coherent, but what the consequence is of living them when you actually live out a certain belief. And in the same spirit, I try to extend those ideas, use those novels as a springboard, and examine the ideas themselves, generate something new out of them. So I've been interested in the nature of time, and specifically what is the consequence of living different conceptions of time. Whether we have a tendency to think that the most important events in the world are the ones that are most visible, most dramatic, but it may be that the sum total of small events is actually more important. That's been an idea that I have pursued. And so from the literature back to the ideas, back to the literature, to see it, how it could generate something useful to us by drawing dotted lines from these geniuses to our problems.
Okay, so you couldn't think of people inhabiting 2 different worlds. But let's see if there are questions that hit at the middle. So creativity is full of myths. And one myth is epiphany. The idea that a flash of inspiration is what produces a radically new idea. Epiphanies used to have a religious meaning. the secular meaning is kind of more due to James Joyce. But epiphanies are rooted in the popular imagination. You have the Eureka moment from Archimedes, the apple falling for Newton. Both, they are real myths. But a sudden realization is something persistent as a myth in creativity. So the question is, and I'll start with Bill, do you believe in epiphanies?
I actually do. Okay. But it's only after the field has been well plowed. Okay. You're working on a problem, or you're trying to come up with something new, and you've been studying the problem, and you're really into it. You've analyzed it. You're trying to figure out, how can I address this issue or this thing I'm trying to create? And then sometimes you do something, and it's like you come with a solution. It's like it's okay, it works. It feels but it's not like you haven't made it. You haven't gotten there. Okay. And then sometimes you'll be there, and you'll be working on a problem, and then and because you've been thinking about it so much, that you've been working on it so much, that all of a sudden you'll get an inspiration. Let me call it that. Something that all of a sudden clicks, and you know it, and this is a good idea. Sometimes you're proved later wrong. Later you're proved wrong, but you think you've got a good idea at least. And I do believe that happens, but it only happens because you're really prepared for it. That you've really done your work, and you're really working.
Picasso was the one who said the inspiration exists, but it has to find you working.
Yes.
Saul, you agree with that?
I do agree with that. In the history of poetry and poetics, the idea has been focused on how much can the exercise of your will, result in a great poem. And on one extreme, you have, let's say, Edgar Allan Poe, who insists that he writes his problems with all the method and rigor with which he would solve a problem in arithmetic. That is, it's simply applying the rules. And the other extreme, you have the romantics like Shelley, who insists that inspiration comes like an inconstant wind, and the real creativity can only start where will ends. And these views have been arguing from antiquity to the present. And I think it's clear that there is something that poets and artists and scientists perceive as an epiphany. Those who don't believe in it will try to say that they are actually unconsciously following a set of rules they are unaware of, which has a certain plausibility, because usually people who are in the midst of creativity are so focused on what they're thinking about that their accounts of how they were thinking are not very good, because they're constructed after the fact. And if you look, they're usually constructed based on their belief in some received story about how creativity works in their day, and then they select the facts that believe, but they actually believe it because they actually see it that way. Right. I think what actually happens is very much like the way you describe it, Bill. You work on a problem with all the method that you can, thinking of everything, and then you reach a dead end. Yeah. And then what do? Well, if you're thinking of, for example, the great story of, let's say, Kekulé discovering the benzene ring, which is one of the classics in the literature of creativity, he describes it as he has a dream, that therefore completely unwilled, of a snake biting its own tail. Okay? And that suggests the form to him. But what I think it really happens in cases like that is that you obsess. You have a problem, and every time you encounter some other shape, some other idea, you quickly mentally apply it to that problem and see if it will work. And when it doesn't, you forget, because you're doing it so quickly and so often. But when it works, you remember that, and it feels like a singular event that happened against your will. So what you've done is actually you can't will the last step of a creative act, but you also can't will to be struck by lightning. You can, however, put yourself out in a field during a storm and increase the odds. And in that sense, the will actually makes a difference. Yeah. So it really, there's something happening there which makes both accounts make sense. I mean,
there's an interesting, in this room, particularly with engineers, there's an interesting lecture that was given by Rankin in 1856 or so, when he took the chair of civil engineering at Glasgow University. And in it, he talks about theoretical and applied mechanics, okay? And in theoretical mechanics, it's about what is the idea, and you got to wait until you get it right. Applied mechanics is, what am I going to do? Right. Okay? And in engineering, a lot of times, we're going to build the building. We got a deadline. We're going to deliver something. Okay? Is it going to be inspired or not? But we have the thing. And so you have these two things. There's some things where you cannot. You got to wait. You got to until you get it right. And then there's other things where you just got to get it something out there and do your best. But sometimes I like the pressure of a deadline. Because you're really. You really got to get into it, and you're like, this isn't working, and you got to get the drawings out the door. So
to the risk of, and this will be interesting if there are disagreements, to the risk of saying something similar to what has been said, yeah, but saying it in a way that I'm disagreeing, I will say that I don't believe in epiphanies.
Okay.
The structure of benzene is fine. The Kekulé falling asleep in front of the fireplace is probably a myth. Okay, but usually problems have lots of pieces in the puzzle, and then there is one final piece, and that final piece is not very different than the other pieces, except that is the last one. And I may have had maybe 3 good ideas in my career, and for the life of me, I don't remember when they came to me. Mm-hmm. Now, regarding the point that you are making with Edgar Allan Poe and Shelley, I think the question behind there, at least in the case of Edgar Allan Poe, was, can creativity be automated? Because that's what Edgar Allan Poe argued. So, do you think that this is possible?
Well, again, you can, yes and no. I mean, the yes would be, this is what Francis Bacon meant when he said that we cannot base science on individual genius. You base it on an institution with a set of methods, and his vision has largely worked. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you could really say that if you could teach creativity to produce it, by following a set of rules, why would you want to call the result of that creative? Mm-hmm. I mean, you call it creative when not anybody could do it. Mm-hmm. When you cannot program a machine just to do it, it requires something else. So I guess you could say you can institutionalize progress, but that's one step short of automating creativity. It creates the conditions for it.
Let me go to the next one in here, unless you want to comment on this, because the next question will play right in your hands.
Okay.
And is this. You could argue, and probably you will disagree, that you operate with more or less free of constraints.
Do you? No, I would.
Well, let me just pose the question. Whereas if you are in science, your constraints are how the natural world works, and you have to devise tricks to make it reveal how it's actually working. So you are constrained by reality. You are very much constrained by zoning laws, where the things are, and a whole bunch of other things. Yeah. Now, the one who said it in the context of art about relating constraints and creativity was Orson Welles, who said, the absence of constraints is the enemy of art. So, do constraints help you or hinder possible solutions for you, Bill?
I think it helps a lot. I mean, give me a tough problem where anything can go, any budget, anything you can create is a terrible problem. Give me a tough problem that's got there's certain constraints you got to, and a lot of people say design is search for constraints.
So what has been something that stands out as having really horrible constraints that you have faced?
Well, I'm doing this building in London where I have to go over, near Waterloo train station, I have to go over 8 tube lines in an underground subway station. And so I got to figure out a way to span 1.5 million square feet of building over this huge distance, okay? And it's a much more interesting building because of it. If it was just a greenfield site, who cares, and so, yeah, I love constraints. I think it's important for you to have your own constraints.
Mm-hmm. So how do you see constraints on your side?
Well, think of writing a sonnet. I mean, it has to have 14 lines. It has to have a certain. Why not just write a 16-line sonnet? Why not write an 18? Let it. But the creativity comes when you have to observe the form and you have to find a novel way of doing it. I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was who said that writing, free verse is like playing tennis without a net. It should be real easy to play tennis without a net, but it's not. It's not tennis anymore. There's nothing to do.
I normally wouldn't remember this, but I think it was Robert Frost.
Is it Robert Frost? Yeah.
But I think it's important for people to set their own constraints. Okay. And maybe people heard me lecture before. I've talked about this. I was working with an artist named James Turrell who does these incredible minimalist installations. And he and I were both making a presentation to a potential donor, and I described what we had done as like Misesian simplicity because of the people I grew up with came out of Mises' office. And then he said, no, Quaker simplicity, okay? And then I was so, those few words, no, Quaker simplicity, piqued my curiosity so much, I started going to the Quaker Meeting House over here on Green, whatever, and just what does it mean to be a Quaker? And how does that affect your aesthetic sensibility? Okay, so here's a man who was raised to believe in simplicity in speech, dress, okay, and then his mother always told him to step into the light. And if you look at his art, it is all about simplicity and light. Okay, so then I started asking, well, what are the things that I value? And you should all do this to yourself. What do you value? I made a list, okay? And some things you might say have value as far as good or bad, but others are just your personal values. I mean, I prefer simplicity to complexity. There's not a value in that, okay? I value simplicity, but someone else can value complexity. And there's a whole series of these things, and when you do that and you start thinking about, and what are your values outside of your work that affects your work, or the way I put it is, what is it that you value based on the way you're raised or whatever that affects your aesthetic sensibilities? And I think that self-examination is helpful. And that's about setting limits on yourself. I am not, we've done a few projects with Frank Gehry, and after that I'm not as interested in working with him because, I'm more interested in more clean minimalism than something that's flowery and, it's not.
So let me use Frank Gehry to go to the next question. So Frank Gehry was not really that well known until he hit mid-50s, maybe 60s. Yeah. And there are architects and people in your line of work that peak
Yeah.
late. There are writers that peak early, and some that have longer careers. And there are people, we talk about Orson Welles. He was in the cover of Time magazine by 23. By 26, he made Citizen Kane. And virtually after that, he was never able to live to the expectations that he created for himself. So, I don't know who said this, that the best way to make a bad work of art is to try to make a great one. But what do you see the drawbacks of peaking very early? Saul?
Well, it really depends on how you, obviously if you peak really early, that already suggests you're not going to do anything else. But you mean succeed really
or
early.
Succeeding, yeah. Actually, not.
You're begging the question if you say peak.
Yeah,
right?
not,
Very good.
Not falling to the curse of what some people, some critics have called the curse of importantitis. That you have done something so amazing
Yes.
early that the next things that follow, you cannot match that.
Then you're afraid to experiment and take a chance. So you keep repeating the same thing over and over again. But what really is happening, I think, in a case like that, is that you have ceased to value the process of experimenting and are looking for the secure result. And that's clear, I think pretty clear what happened with Orson Welles. But if what you are interested in is, the sheer joy of finding something new, the process itself, you're willing to fail. And that is what's necessary to get to something else. You will not, some people simply have one idea and then they can't give it up. But if what you're interested in is the process which happened to generate an idea, that'll be different. It's how you really can look at it differently and makes a big difference.
So you can name writers that have fall prey to that and then they can never live up to what they thought.
Yes, I mean, they do one great work and then
That's it.
there's not a whole lot. Or there are writers who, keep doing something different and having not just successes, but surprising successes one after another. Dickens would be an example of that. His great novels are really very different from each other, and that's what
So
you wouldn't
do
expect.
you see this on your side, Bill?
Well, yeah, I mean, everybody wants an icon, iconic tower. God help us, First of all, the public decides what's iconic, not the designer. Okay, and a lot of times, a lot of the cities, particularly in the Middle East and the Far East, you look at that, it's like all these buildings are trying to be iconic, and they're all, and for me, they're like a bunch of diners in a crowded restaurant with bad acoustics. Everyone's shouting so loud to be heard, and you hear no one. They're all drowning each other out, and I. An architect I respect a great deal, Richard Rogers out of London. He hates the word iconic, and he's done some of the most iconic things out there.
He has that luxury.
Lloyd's of London, to the cheese grater that just finished. But going back to something that you said earlier about you said three good ideas and stuff like that. My goal is to have 5 slides. Okay, by the time my career is done, I want to have 5 slides of 5 good buildings. Okay, I'm probably going to do hundreds along the way. Okay, so what are the ones? An architect I used to work with a lot, who passed away, Myron Goldsmith. He always used to show these slideshows, and we said, "Why do you always keep showing the same buildings?" He said, "Well, they were the only good ones, And so I don't think just if you're lucky if you have 5 slides. Okay.
So something that is also a myth when you talk about creativity is that especially in art, is that of creative endeavors is the one that people equate more with flashes of inspiration. But normally, everything that Picasso did, you can find the many sketches. I was at the Guggenheim in Bilbao, and he did Las Meninas, and he did 70 sketches for this in different kinds. And they are all part of the record. However, in some fields, like math, you present the final thing, and it has to be perfect. And how is that you came up with the idea gets eliminated. What people like Wittgenstein call you have the scaffold, but then you kick out the ladder that reach you there. So and in some fields, like science, the scaffold is removed. And in some things that you don't have all the draft that led to a great piece of literature. In some cases, you can have hints. You probably can have more in your line of work. Mm-hmm. But is this business of the scaffold and removing it, is this what contributes to the mystique that the ideas have to appear fully formed? Or there are benefits in seeing all the dead ends and this shaky scaffold that led to the final concept?
Well, in traditional poetics, the basic difference between poetry and life is that in a great poem, every detail fits perfectly. You can give a reason why it is there and pulls its weight, like a perfectly designed organism. But to get to, that means that the process of getting to it has to be erased. It's one kind of novel which can deal with the creative process, but will how, it would be like Nabokov's novel, The Gift, which is about how the gift got written at the end of the novel, The Gift. But it is itself a perfect structure about the making of it. Other writers have decided that they really want all the messiness of the creative process to be visible as part of the work. So how do you do that? Well, there are some of the great masterpieces of the world that have done this, a handful, and several of them happen to be Russian, so why I'm interested in them. War and Peace would be one, for instance. Dostoevsky's novel, The Idiot, would be another. Byron's Don Juan. What they do is they publish the book serially so that they cannot go back and correct, okay? And then they allow, for example, events in the real world to affect the story. So that, you're beginning your novel in publishing it, let's say in 1873, and a war starts in 1877, which is what happens with Anna Karenina, and you work that in. Okay? So it's perfectly clear that you cannot have planned the entire structure in advance. Okay? You make that visible. And then part of the interest of the story becomes the real process, the actual innovation which is not going to be cleared up, and it becomes visible. In Byron's poem, for instance, part of the point of what makes it so great is that there are a lot of really bad stanzas. Because if you are really going to create well, you're going to have some bad ones, and part of the interest is how the good suddenly arises and why at that moment. So this is a fairly unusual way of doing it, but it's a way of recognizing the creative process as inherently messy, as opposed to what is the traditional finished work of art, which is perfectly ordered.
So how do you see this? I mean, there are a few cases, I don't know enough. There are probably myths about Frank Lloyd Wright having the client on his way and the guy working like hell to produce Falling Water. And somehow the client arrives and the concept is almost fully formed in there. How do you see the role of the scaffold?
Well, in the kind of, I don't know about Frank Lloyd Wright, but in the work that we do, it's all collaborative work. Mm-hmm. In the end, you can't figure out where it came from, okay? Or who, because we'll have a lot of people. Okay, we're starting a competition this week for a very, very tall building in the Middle East, okay, and we're all around the table. There's nothing, there's no design on the wall. There's things that describe the problem, and then we just all start together. And if we do it well, everyone will claim it, okay. If we do it badly, no one will claim it, okay. But in fact, you know, you cannot. And a lot of times, you know, we have tables in our office. We call them kindergarten tables. They're 5-foot square little wooden tables, and you get like 8 people sitting around and more people standing around. You got pin-up space around it. And what you do is, you know, you fight for the pencil. Okay, you draw something. You have an idea, and you explain your idea to your collaborators. They will then hear your idea through their idea. And even if they repeat it back what you thought you said, they will not say what you said. They'll say something else. And it'll be different, and it'll be probably better than what you thought the idea was. And by the time you go around, and this happens all the time, you know, you don't know who did it, okay? By the time you walk away from the table. You know, you got something else. That you're in a place different from where anyone who came to the table started.
Julio said he had 3 ideas and he didn't know where they come from. You say in your firm you have ideas and you don't know where because they're collaborative.
Right.
But is it possible that within the individual something analogous to the collaborative is going on, multiple processes at once, and that is why you also don't know where it comes from?
So we'll squeeze 2 more questions and then we'll open up. So we mentioned this in passing. Some people doing work that is regarded as their best early, and some people, these people may have kept working throughout. Picasso had a long, long life, but probably the most revolutionary work he did when he was about in the mid-20s, but then he lived until late 80s. And some people kept progressing more. Cézanne will be in that category in visual arts. But how do you see this from both perspectives? In some areas, it's unlikely that someone will work like hell over the weekends and will produce a tall building in Chicago in mid-20s because it's more collaborative and lots of things have to happen. But do you see a difference in creative outputs that happen early in life? T.S. Eliot would be one, Ezra Pound would be another one, or late, Frost on the other side. On your side, buildings, I see people who peak. They hit the stride in the mid-60s and they keep going up to Frank Lloyd Wright did the Guggenheim in New York in the mid-80s, his mid-80s. So how do you see a qualitative difference in work that is regarded by the field as creative, which is early as opposed to something that depends on a lifetime of experience and is late?
Yeah. Well, you know, in architecture, I would think about architects, you know, a young Turk is in their 40s, okay? You know, that's, and I'm not sure why. I think it's because you just have to learn so much and see so much along the way. You know, I first met Frank Gehry before he was, quote, Frank Gehry. You know, he was in his 50s probably. He was coming through the office. We were doing a big project in Spain. We gave him a part of the project to him to do, and this is pre-Guggenheim, because you know, because we did the engineering for the Guggenheim after that. You know, and so you know, here's this guy who blossoms very, very, very late. And part of the thing is, a lot of times I'll have a very, you'll see a creative spark in a young engineer or architect. Sometimes you got to like keep them calm until they learn their business. You know, because I see people who have totally failures in their career because they shot up too fast without having done their homework, without having spent their time in the trenches learning their craft. Okay, and they never, and it's hard to go back and pick up those steps that you missed because you went up too fast. Okay, and I see that a lot. And so one of the hardest things I have is when I have a young person who really, they're good and you know they're good and they know that you know they're good, and try to keep them calm, you know, to slug through these projects so they learn their trade before you turn them loose. You know.
How do you see it?
You know, when I was growing up in New York, there was an inspirational ad on the subway which showed a Gauguin-esque figure behind bars, and it said, at 35, Paul Gauguin worked in a bank. And underneath, someone had scribbled, at 35, Mozart was dead.
Only in New York. Yeah.
Well, you know, I think there is, you know, a difference, but I'm going to just guess how it is. For someone who is doing it early, and particularly the sort of one you're describing as peaking, the work has a kind of finished quality. This is it, and everything else will be a continuation of it. Mm-hmm. But if you look, for example, at Tolstoy, who kept being creative in different ways throughout his life, any one of the works looks like it's got some flaw, something that doesn't quite fit, because it's leading to the next inspiration. And it's as if he is offering each work as a tentative statement. And that tentativeness, that slight unfinishedness, is the sign of things that are going to be creative over a lifetime. Because being too finished is a sign that you probably will not be.
Yeah, and I suspect different you know, areas would have very different trajectories, you know. I mean, clearly, you know, a musician very different than, you know, an architect, okay, as far as art engineer.
Let me close with this one, which is the question for the ages. Can creativity be taught? You alluded to this, that if it could be taught, it wouldn't be creative. But there's a huge spectrum of creativity, from the everybody can be creative kind of thing that you would instill in K-12, or if you're running an organization that you want everybody to sort of participate in that, to Tolstoy here, okay, and everything between. So do you think that you can sharpen creative skills in people by means of a course, or by immersing them in environments where they see people who are really good at some skill, and they kind of learn by imitation in there?
I'll do the converse. I think you can certainly kill creativity. Okay, by the way you teach. You know, I remember, and I went to school a few years ago, and the whole thing about, and I'll do a structural engineering example, where the design class is the professor has drawn the beam framing, and the question is it a W18 or a W21? Okay, that's not creative, that's sizing, okay? You know, as opposed to, here's a white piece of paper, what should the structure be? Okay, and you know, and the whole thing about permitting bad ideas to exist, or be, you know, like sometimes we'll try to break young engineers out of their shell to get them to like loosen up, okay? Sometimes we'll have, maybe we call them a design charrette, which is, you know, it's a French, it's, you know, where people throw out ideas. And I require everyone to come up with at least one bad idea and don't say which one it is. Okay? You know, so it takes the pressure off, because people, it's like the whole thing about you got to be a genius, or you have to produce a great work of art. That'll lock anybody up. Okay, so you got to take the pressure off, but still try. So I think you can kill creativity. I don't know if you can teach it, but you could certainly promote it, or you could make somebody more creative.
Okay, so
Yeah,
before you answer, keep in mind that there are many courses called creative writing.
Yeah, well, some
So
people are
what's-
not going to like me for that reason, but of course you can kill creativity. The short answer would be that's what graduate school in English does. We have all these bright young people who have interesting ideas about literature, and they go to graduate school, and what they come out doing is knowing a lot, but when they take a literary work, they can deconstruct it, they can do a feminist analysis, post-colonial analysis, but they can no longer think. Okay? They can no longer imagine anything, because they're showing off a skill that require, and a body of knowledge that required so much effort to acquire, and that's what they're rewarded for, that they feel that's it. That's one of the signs of that is showing how many footnotes you can have. I mean, to show you've done your homework. But real creativity is not concerned with doing your homework. Okay. We had a philosopher here maybe 20 years ago who I once presented this question to, can you teach creativity? And his initial answer was to answer like an analytic philosopher and look at the nature of the term and say, well, of course not, because if you could, it wouldn't be creative. To which my reply was, so what do you do with your graduate students? How do you teach? And then he got the point. That is, you can teach them to be creative, but not by following a set of rules. You do it by a kind of analogy. Instead of teaching conclusions, you model. Here was a difficult problem, and here is how so-and-so, here would be the obvious solution, here is how so-and-so tried to solve it, here's how I tried to solve another problem. And you go through the process until you have when the person is on the right track, they will feel it, although they can't exactly say why. And when they're on the wrong track, they will feel that too. That's how you model creative. It's not teaching any particular creative solution, it's teaching the feel of a process and when you're on the right track.
Okay, great. So one final comment before we close it. There is this book just appeared by Peter Thiel, which I was ready to hate because Thiel is the one who is offering the Thiel fellowships, which are basically for people who want to be entrepreneurs, and he encourages them to drop out of college. But it's full of ideas, and one idea was why there are so many people in Silicon Valley with Asperger's syndrome. People who are not very good reading social cues, starting companies. And it's because, according to him, you don't fall prey to the herd mentality. You ignore things, you do your own thing, and that makes the possibility of discovering something unique, at least in place, being more likely. So we're going to close this. I think that, as I said, we decided to do this, invite people with completely different backgrounds. Maybe in the future we'll have another writer, or an architect, a filmmaker, an artist. But the idea of how do they think about what they do, and that's why we want people who have actually done something, I think is a subject worth exploring, and I'm pretty sure you'll agree with me that there are so many more questions that you can explore in this intersection. So I want to thank Saul and Bill and all of you.